Snow drifted like ash through the wreckage of northern France, the air thick with smoke and surrender. The echo of gunfire had faded, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of German boots pressing against the frozen ground. Under a flickering moon, a small convoy of Allied nurses stood trembling, hands raised, eyes hollow with exhaustion. Their white armbands, once a symbol of mercy, were now targets. One of them, Margaret Ellison, no more than 26, held herself upright even as her knees shook. Her lips parted, voice low, quivering. They said women wouldn't be taken prisoner. A German officer barked orders in clipped tones, his flashlight cutting across the women's faces like a blade. They were stripped of their medical bags, lined up beside a truck splattered with mud and blood. None of them spoke as they were forced aboard. The cold bit through their uniforms. Somewhere behind them, a barn still smoldered, the place they had tended to wounded soldiers only hours ago. As the truck jolted forward, Margaret gripped the side rail, her breath visible in the icy air. The other nurses, Grace, Eleanor, and Ruth, huddled close, whispering prayers. They expected to be sent east, deeper into the Reich, where few prisoners returned. But then, through the wind, they heard something strange. The officer mentioned a word that didn't fit the terror they knew. Transport, Atlantic. Margaret frowned. Atlantic. That was west, toward open water, toward the unknown. She glanced at the horizon as dawn broke faintly over the ruined countryside. The question clawed at her mind. Why would prisoners be sent across the ocean to Canada, the enemy's enemy, in the middle of a war? And in that frozen dawn, for the first time, fear gave way to confusion, and a spark of something even more dangerous, hope. The nurses were herded through the misty French harbor before sunrise, their breath fogging in the cold air as soldiers shouted orders in German. The creak of ropes, the slap of waves against steel hulls, and the stench of fuel filled. The train screeched to a halt in the middle of a vast, snow-blanketed wilderness. The nurses pressed their faces to the frosted windows, expecting to see another prison, another barbed cage of cold cruelty. Instead, the scene outside was strangely peaceful. Rows of pine trees heavy with snow, a sky glowing faintly pink with dawn, and a set of low wooden cabins clustered behind a simple wire fence. A sign read, Camp 135. Armed guards waited on the platform, but their expressions weren't filled with hatred. They spoke quietly, gesturing politely for the women to step down. Margaret's boots sank into soft snow as she descended. She braced herself for barking orders, but instead heard one of the guards say in careful English, "Welcome to Canada, miss." The words sounded impossible. Canada? The others looked around in disbelief. This wasn't a dungeon or a labor camp. It looked more like a sleepy logging village. The guards handed them wool blankets and directed them to cabins, warmed by crackling stoves. Inside, the air smelled of pinewood and soap. Real beds lined the walls. A kettle hissed softly on a small stove. Grace sank into a chair, tears welling in her eyes. "This can't be real," she whispered. "It's a trick. It has to be." Margaret stayed silent, her mind flashing back to France. The echo of gunfire, the freezing nights, the desperate faces of wounded soldiers they couldn't save. How could the same war hold both that horror and this strange gentleness? Days passed, and the camp revealed more surprises. Meals arrived on time, stews thick with vegetables, bread still warm. The Canadian guards even offered them books, knitting supplies, and paper to write letters. "All according to the Geneva Convention," one officer said with a polite nod, as if quoting a sacred promise. The nurses exchanged wary glances. They had been taught to expect the worst, to survive brutality, not kindness. But as the days turned to weeks, their suspicion began to waver. In the quiet between snowfalls, laughter started returning, soft at first, then stronger. Some played cards, others taught each other songs from home. Yet every night, as lights dimmed and the camp grew silent, Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling. How, she thought, can enemy prisoners live better than the civilians back home? The question lingered like a ghost in the warm air, reminding them that even comfort could feel like captivity when you didn't know why it was given, or when it might be taken away. Winter in Ontario softened with time. The snow outside Camp 135 no longer felt like a prison wall. It became part of the rhythm of their strange new life. Smoke curled from chimneys each morning, and laughter sometimes rose from the dining hall, quiet but real. The nurses had begun to adapt, though none of them would admit it aloud. Margaret stood near the infirmary window one morning, the light spilling through in golden streaks. A young Canadian guard named Corporal Dawson hovered by the door, watching her bandage a soldier's frostbitten hand. He was barely 20, his uniform crisp and too large for his frame. "You've done this before," he said, eyes wide with admiration. Margaret smiled faintly. "Too many times, but never where there's peace outside the window." He chuckled softly, then hesitated before pulling a worn photograph from his pocket. A family standing before a small farmhouse. "My brother," he said quietly. "He was at Dunkirk. Didn't make it out." Margaret's hands paused. Dunkirk had been chaos. She'd treated the wounded who did make it out. She reached over, placed the photograph gently on the table and nodded. "I'm sorry," she whispered. In that small exchange, the lines of war blurred, enemy, ally, soldier, nurse, all fading into something more human. As weeks passed, connections deepened. Grace and Eleanor began teaching English to younger guards eager to learn. In return, they learned fragments of French-Canadian slang, laughter echoing through the barracks. The Red Cross arranged supervised visits to a nearby village, where the nurses tended to children with frostbite and mothers exhausted from rationing. For the first time since capture, the air felt lighter. Margaret walked freely within the camp boundaries, her hands no longer trembling from fear, but from a quiet uncertainty. It was freedom, but not quite. Every act of kindness carried a shadow of guilt. Letters from home were few, censored and delayed, and each one reminded them that people were still dying across the ocean. One evening, as a blizzard howled beyond the fence, Margaret sat by the fire and wrote a letter to her mother. She told her about the camp, about the strange kindness of strangers, and how she no longer knew whether she was a prisoner or a guest. She signed it with trembling fingers and handed it to a guard for mailing. Weeks later, she asked if there had been a reply. The guard hesitated, then shook his head. Margaret looked out through the frost-covered window at the endless forest. The letter, like their lives, seemed lost between worlds, never reaching home, never truly leaving. And as the snow fell again, she realized that even in this quiet place, captivity wasn't just about fences, it was about the heart still waiting for peace. The winter of 1945 crept in with whispers, soft, uncertain, and dangerous. At first, it was only rumors that drifted through Camp 135 like smoke through the pines. A guard's careless word, a passing mention from a Red Cross officer. Germany was faltering. Cities were falling. The Reich was breaking apart. The nurses huddled around the camp's small radio whenever they could, pretending to clean or sew as static carried across the room. A British voice crackled through the noise. Paris liberated, Allied forces advancing into the Rhineland. The words made Margaret's heart pound. Eleanor gasped, hand over her mouth. Grace started to cry quietly, shoulders shaking. For the first time in years, the impossible seemed near. The end of the war, but hope, as they learned, came with chains. The day after the first broadcast, the guards grew tense. Orders changed. The gates were checked twice as often, and barbed wire glistened with new frost. One of the younger guards, Dawson, pulled Margaret aside as she was walking to the infirmary. His expression was grim. "Miss Ellison," he murmured, "be careful what you hope for." "Freedom is not always what it seems," Margaret frowned. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then simply said, "When governments make promises, people like us are the ones who wait for them to keep it." And with that, he walked away. The camp's mood shifted. Some women began packing what little they owned, certain they'd soon be released. Others refused to believe it, fearing disappointment more than captivity. "If they truly meant to free us," Eleanor whispered one night, "why tighten the fences?" That evening, the sky came alive with color. The northern lights shimmered in green and violet waves across the frozen heavens, dancing silently over the camp's barbed wire. The nurses stood outside in silence, faces turned upward. The lights reflected in their eyes like ghosts of freedom, beautiful, unreachable. Margaret's breath hung in the air as she whispered, "What if they've forgotten us here?" No one answered. The only sound was the wind through the trees, carrying the distant hum of a world waking up from war. Inside their cabins, the women spoke in hushed tones about escape, about letters never answered, about home. But deep down, each of them felt the same uneasy truth: the war might end. But that didn't guarantee freedom. As dawn broke over the snow-covered camp, Margaret stood by the fence, fingers gripping the cold wire. Somewhere beyond those trees, the world was changing. But here, time stood still, and for the first time, the promise of peace felt as uncertain as the war itself. Spring thawed the last traces of snow around Camp 135. The pines dripped quietly in the morning light, and the air smelled of wet earth and renewal. Yet beneath the soft murmur of the season, tension lingered, thick and uneasy. Weeks had passed since the last radio broadcast. The world beyond the fence was changing faster than they could imagine, but the camp remained frozen in time, waiting for news that never came. Then one morning, a convoy of military trucks arrived, engines rumbling through the mud. The guards stood at attention as an unfamiliar figure stepped out. A tall man in a crisp Allied uniform, his coat bearing both the Union Jack and the Red Cross insignia. The women gathered hesitantly near the main cabin, hearts pounding. The officer removed his cap, his face weary but kind. "Ladies," he began, "I am Major Andrew Whitmore of the Allied Repatriation Commission. I'm here to tell you the war in Europe has ended." For a moment, silence fell. Then the sound erupted, gasps, laughter, sobs, disbelief. Grace clutched Eleanor's arm. Margaret felt her knees weaken. It's over. The nightmare that had started in the chaos of France was finally ending. But as the joy swelled, the officer's tone shifted. "There's something else you must understand," he continued. "You were never prisoners of war." The laughter died instantly. Margaret frowned. What do you mean, never prisoners?" Major Whitmore sighed. "You were classified as protected civilians, medical personnel under the Geneva Convention. When you were captured in France, the Germans intended to send you east. The Allies intervened. You were secretly transferred here to Canada for your own safety." The words hit like a blow. The women stared at him, stunned. Grace shook her head. "Our own safety? We were locked behind fences, cut off from our families. You were kept under Red Cross supervision," the officer explained softly. "We couldn't risk the Germans discovering your location. If they had, you'd have been recaptured or worse. The secrecy was for your protection." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "So all this time, we weren't prisoners. We were hidden," Whitmore nodded. "Protected, isolated, yes, but free in every other sense. You will be repatriated within the week." The camp was silent, except for the wind rustling through the pines. Margaret looked around, the cabins, the barbed wire, the guard towers. All the fear, the longing, the sleepless nights suddenly reframed. It hadn't been captivity. It had been exile, wrapped in mercy and misunderstanding, but that mercy carried its own weight. They had been safe, yes, but silenced. Their families had mourned them as lost, their letters never sent, their names erased by secrecy. Margaret stepped away from the crowd, walking toward the edge of the maple grove that bordered the camp. The morning sun filtered through the leaves, dappling the ground in shifting light. She placed her hand against the bark of a tree and whispered, more to herself than anyone, "We were prisoners of peace." Behind her, the camp gates creaked open for the first time. Not with force, but with quiet reverence. Freedom had come at last. But it was not the freedom they had imagined. It was gentler, more complex, an uneasy gift wrapped in silence. And as the wind carried the scent of spring through the open gate, Margaret felt tears slip down her cheeks, not for captivity, but for everything they'd lost in the name of protection. The Atlantic was calm when they sailed home. The nurses stood on deck, their hair whipped by salt wind, staring east toward the grey horizon where England waited. Freedom was supposed to feel lighter than this, but as the shoreline appeared, Margaret realized her heart carried a strange weight, a longing for the quiet pines of Canada, for the camp that had been both cage and sanctuary. When they arrived in London, the world called them heroes. Crowds greeted them with cheers and flags, newspaper headlines reading, "Lost nurses return alive." But behind every smile lingered confusion. No one wanted to hear about warm cabins, polite guards, or the humanity shown by the so-called enemy. People wanted tales of hardship and escape. So the women stayed silent. Margaret tried to resume her life at the hospital. She worked long hours, treating the wounded returning from the front, pretending she had simply endured another chapter of war. Yet at night, when the city slept under the dim glow of rationed lamps, her mind drifted back to Camp 135, the laughter in the snow, the letters that never came, the northern lights shimmering above the barbed wire. Some of the nurses wrote memoirs, quietly published and mostly ignored. Others never spoke of Canada again. Years turned into decades, and Camp 135 vanished beneath forest and moss, its story fading into history's footnotes. But not for Margaret. In the summer of 1970, she returned. The journey was quiet, the air warm and filled with the hum of cicadas. Where the camp once stood, there was nothing but open meadow and young maple trees swaying in the breeze. Margaret knelt in the grass, setting down a small bouquet of wildflowers, violet and white, the same colors that once framed the camp's frozen fences. She ran her fingers through the soil, feeling its warmth. "We thought we were prisoners," she whispered, her voice trembling but steady. "But Canada taught us what freedom really means." As she stood, the wind carried her words through the clearing, rustling the leaves like an unseen reply. The camera would linger there, the ruins of history blending with nature's quiet forgiveness. Sunlight spilling over a land that once held strangers, not as captives, but as guests of peace, and in that stillness Margaret smiled, not for what was lost, but for what had been found, the understanding that even in war's darkest hour, humanity had not been defeated. It had simply found refuge behind barbed wire, waiting to be remembered.